Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar co-organized by the ITU WHO Focus Group on AI and Health and the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School. My name is Matthias Gröschel. I'm a physician scientist and a member of the Focus Group on AIforHealth, which is co-hosted by ITU and WHO and which is convened under the umbrella of AI for Good, UN's leading initiative around how AI can help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. If you're interested in knowing more about this focus group on AI for Health or AI for Good, please reach out. You can find all relevant contact information on Google or otherwise online. We're always looking for people to join the effort. I have the immense privilege to introduce today's session as part of this AI and Health series, Contextualizing Progress in the AI Revolution by David Shaywitz. David and I had a brief check-in earlier this week to walk David through the logistics of today. And I was really impressed by whatever keyword I dropped, David was able to elaborate on it with immense detail, including a book recommendation. So instead of talking 5 minutes, we talked an hour. And yeah, if you don't know what book to read next after today's session, you will know for sure. So far, the informal introduction, of course, the formal introduction is a little different. Yeah, David graduated from Harvard College in biochemistry, and then went on to pursue the MD-PhD program of Harvard and MIT, followed by a residency in internal medicine and a fellowship in endocrinology at Massachusetts General Hospital. He did a postdoc in the Harvard Stem Cell Institute and then embarked on a private sector career that encompassed drug discovery, development, strategy, commercialization, genomics and big data, digital health, and venture capital. Last year, David founded Astounding Health Tech Advisory Services, where he provides consulting to senior research and development leaders in industry around how to leverage digital and data opportunities. David has also written extensively in these topics for several very known journals that I won't even start to list here. And I think there's really very few people who have seen so many angles of the healthcare and innovation space that we're truly honored to have David here today. Dear audience, if you're listening here on YouTube or Twitter, I encourage you to join the Zoom link to ask questions and to interact with us. Please ask away during David's talk using the Q&A functionality. Please don't use the chat. And to ask your short questions, that'll make it easier for me to manage David's talk and your questions. So with no further ado, please, David, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Matthias. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. All right. Yeah, it was so great to connect with you, to have the opportunity to participate before this forum, which I authentically feel unworthy of, but at least we'll try to make it worth everybody's time. I'll talk for maybe 45 minutes. We'll leave some time at the end for some questions. It's going to be more of a high-level overview, trying to offer perspective on sort of how we got here and sort of how to contextualize where we are. So let me get to this, share. There we go. All right. I can minimize this. All right. So I think you already heard about who I am. We can get past that. Okay. So essentially, the talk as a whole will be divided into 3 parts. First is on the digital revolution. Second is on calibrating expectations for technology adoption. I think that we don't necessarily think about it right, and I think we can learn a lot from history. And then we'll look more specifically on, of course, where we are with AI, including the insight from several recent books, and also a little bit about some of the arc of different books. Of where the literature is taking us. And I really look forward to I'm hoping is some global perspective, which in many ways I may lack. And so I'm really looking forward to sort of hearing how some of these challenges are being examined around the world. That'll be really very valuable for me. So digital revolution. If you sort of want to have a timeline of this, you can say that you can really just follow the Economist covers. Starting with 2010, people talked about big data and the data deluge, to automation and the rise of the robots, to AI in 2015. One of the sort of key books in describing where we are was this book called The Second Machine Age. It's was a very optimistic take about how this emerging digital technology and AI and computation can change the world. And it was a very generally optimistic view of it. As one of the authors said, quote, "People will be freed from want, drudgery, and toil, not just in the rich world, but everywhere." So that seems optimistic. And then they also describe the author's unimaginable opportunities for innovation that will improve just about everything. Now, they did mention that they were concerned about increases in inequality, and they did discuss that. But on balance, they really had this incredibly positive view. One of the aspects of what this digital approach has been the application of it to health, which clearly was an area of opportunity. The World Economic Forum in 2012 defined digital health as essentially applying the most advanced information communication technologies to improve health and healthcare, and it involved a number of different domains. More broadly, and this is something that Denny Osceola at Mass General and I have been discussed for a while, the really idea is that for so long, medicine has been viewed as something that you do in a physician's office. You go in, you're diagnosed, you're treated, and then you go off and live like the 99.999% of the rest of your life. And so the digital health and the tools that are associated with it would seem to provide a way for medicine, we wrote, to break out of the traditional constraints of time and place. Health is in your life is something that occurs continuously. And this provides, in theory, a way to understand patients in the same way they're experiencing their life. And also to offer care, ideally, that's anticipatory or at least timely, rather than just reactive and delayed. Instead of coming into your physician's office when you're already sick and have a problem, in theory, it would be nice if there was a way that some of these technologies could help anticipate a problem and manage it before it becomes a very serious problem. There are some really lofty voices on healthcare. Eric Topol, as one of the leaders, described a scenario in this book I reviewed for the journal, where he just said the iPhone for our age is going to be as transformative as the printing press was in an earlier age. It's going to completely change all the relationships and how we think about things. UCSF Bob Wachter, who I think a lot of us know from his very savvy commentaries around COVID, is really a digital health leader. And he wrote a book that was a lot more grounded actually than the other book, but described in a little bit more measured way, both the opportunities and some of the challenges. But as the technology progressed and as people worked harder, even he started to see some real progress and opportunity. So just to look at one example, how is pharma, to pick an industry, a reasonably large industry, what was their hope for digital health? Well, I can break it down into three buckets. First, they thought digital technologies offer a way to understand disease better and to offer a far more granular assessment of phenotype as well as genotype. It's also an opportunity to better understand the patient experience of disease in ways that you can really understand what's most important to a patient is in the process of experiencing an illness, and to identify more ways to support them and add value to treatment. And then finally, and this has sort of always been the holy grail for a number of industries, but certainly for pharma, that ultimately this closer connection with the patient will provide an opportunity to add value beyond the pill and deliver the much valued solution, not just pills. So to go into these just a little bit more, phenotype, is sort of, in contrast to genotype, is sort of all of the areas on the right, the context of some of the precision medicine initiative. There was some description of what are some examples of a phenotype, or sort of things you can measure, things you can see specifically, for example, through sensors. And the ambition is that just as the Genome Project has allowed us to understand the genome at incredible scale, now maybe with the advent of sensors and other approaches, there's an opportunity to apply a similarly large-scale approach to phenotype, sort of like the next major challenge. The interest in drug development is that with some of these digital health tools, as my med school training colleague Ethan Bass has written about here, what the ambition is to really be able to focus far more on patients and what their subtle needs might be in the development of drugs. And then finally, this is sort of this is the holy grail, the idea of delivering solutions and not simply assets. And this is kind of comes up periodically as sort of the ultimate goal of what pharma is counseled to do. The philosopher Mike Tyson has opined, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So there's some problems with it. First of all, digital health, and we're going to come back to this theme, is not magic. It needs to demonstrate utility, and it struggles, actually, just like traditional medicine. It's hard to show that things work, and a lot of things, even that seem obvious, don't always work. This is the recurrent lesson of medicine, which is why you do studies. And it's all of sort of traditional medicine, and digital health saw it as well. Sticking a wearable on someone doesn't magically provide this enhanced level of understanding or this enhanced morbidity or mortality benefit. And that was arresting for some to discover. The second point is also very important about utilizing technology to understand patients better. We'll come back to that. The third point, again, about going from assets to solutions. I don't think anyone summarized this better than Sachin Jain. This is what he said in a previous role when he was CEO of CareMore, but he was also the former CMIO of Merck. And basically, he says the industry has basically been doing this forever, countless initiatives to move beyond the pill, and then they don't work out, they're shut down, and that they just really can't get it together to develop a future outside of high margin molecules, just as hospitals really can't think about a future without fee for service. So in that context, along comes digital transformation. So digital transformation you can view as sort of the, in the sense like the next big thing. You can see it quantitatively in both the number of times phrases appear in books and in Google searches. And almost the Bible of digital transformation was probably written in 2019 by the CEO and founder of a company called C3.ai, Tom Siebel. And if you want to know how to sort of create a burning platform, this is a very good guide for future consultants out there. Basically, his thesis is, if you don't digitally transform, you're going to die off like the dinosaurs, in those words. He describes technology vectors, cloud, big data, AI, and IoT, and says there's a mass extinction event for all of these reasons. And if you don't transform, you will die. And there are a lot of people who will be delighted to get rid of you. So that's his motivation to do it. Now, not everyone's on board with this. And in fact, as some of this has kind of developed momentum and almost developed a life of its own, some people sort of stood astride the progress and said, wait. One of those is Professor Shishma, Harvard Business School. And this is the concept of the tech last, a response to some of the technology fetishization maybe. And she has described the concept of surveillance capitalism, basically how companies sort of make money by invading privacy and gaining outsized influence. And I think whether or not one agrees with most, all, or some fraction of what she says, I think she captures a lot of general concerns that have started to surface about the power of technology and whether it is being used in the context of the seminar for good. Now, how did all this digital transformation imperative work out for pharma? Well, one of the leaders is the Swiss. I know a lot of folks here are from Switzerland. The Swiss-based, Swiss headquartered company, Novartis. And they have a new physician, scientist, CEO, Voss. And he made a splash when he was appointed on the front page of the Wall Street Journal with an article that where he described his vision, where he said, we need to become a focused medicines company that's powered by data science and digital technology. And he really articulated how he was really sort of leaning into digital transformation as the way he wanted to inflect his company. To quote this excerpt from Fight Club, how's that working out for you? And it's complicated. It is really the answer. He sort of on a podcast interview about a year later, he was asked, how's it all working out? And he was, really appreciatively candid. He said, well, there's been a lot of talk, but very little in terms of actual impact. And this is an important point which we continue to see in terms of this, COVID, that in order to do AI, which everybody wants to do, you need to have, as he says, outstanding data to actually base your ML on. And that's non-trivial, extraordinarily, unimaginably non-trivial to get to that point. And I'm going to quote a technology review paper towards the end that makes exactly the same point. Now, some stuff worked. They were able to, everyone wants a dashboard, an ops dashboard that they actually obsess. It's actually true. These pharma CEOs seem very obsessed with the size of their dashboard, and they like to demonstrate how big their dashboards are. So that seems like a thing. Novartis, AstraZeneca, some others that sort of try to give some instant updates on how the pipeline's going. In some areas, it's predicting free cash flow. Apparently, it works. There's doing some advanced AI analysis pathology, which is a work in progress. And the idea that we're going to essentially put data lake data in and have cure to cancer coming out hasn't yet materialized. And so that brings us to a point, well, geez, this seems like supposed to be a little bit of an uplifting talk, and it seems a little bit down. What's going on here? And I want to sort of, at this point of the talk, highlight that actually the point isn't that technology doesn't matter or that we've overemphasized technology. Technology really does matter. Powerful new technology can radically change science. When you think about the history, and this is a great book, Phase Change by Douglas Robertson, the absolutely outsized impacts of innovation from the microscope, telescope, calculus, computer, the tools completely change the fundamental questions that you're able to ask and absolutely completely change your understanding of nature. Sidney Brenner famously said, progress in science depends on new techniques, discoveries, and ideas, probably in that order. And the point of all this is that, as Nassim Taleb says, he's very critical of the concept of neomania, of like worshiping the new just because it's new. But I think that there's a good reason for health scientists to look to technology, not only because it's new, but because of the opportunities it affords us to improve our understanding of nature. Now, this is, if there's like one point from this talk to take away, it's this. It's that technology does not arrive ready to go. It does not spring, as shown in this image, like Athena fully formed from Zeus's head. That's just not how technology works, even though subconsciously we sort of expect it to happen. We hear about AI and the next minute, let's apply it to curing cancer. And that hasn't historically been the way technologies have evolved. And I think this context is really is critical to understand, and it's certainly the critical point of this talk. There's some wonderful work by Venezuelan and British, I believe, economist Carlotta Perez, where she describes the phases of a technology revolution. And really what you can see is that it occurs over a very long, really a 50-year time span, where the technology comes up in the first phase, the eruption phase. And then there's this speculative frenzy where everyone's trying to figure out what's going to make it and what isn't. There's tons of venture investment, a lot of it, it's like bubblicious, and a bunch of things don't make it. And that's just sort of the nature of people trying to figure out a new technology. Now, ultimately, it becomes instantiated, and then that's when you start to really see the productivity gains from the technology. Once you sort of get past that transition point. So the classic, absolutely classic example is sort of this transition from steam to electrical power. So steam-powered factories were built sort of around a single source of power in this sort of dense three-dimensional configuration. When electricity came along, the source of electric power was swapped in for the steam power, and there was almost no impact on productivity. So just substituted. The simple substitution of electricity for steam did not really give you the impact in productivity. What that really took was actually figuring out how to use electricity more intelligently, including completely reconfiguring the design of the factory into sort of a different layout that actually followed workflow. And then you started to really see the increases in productivity. And it turned out that a lot of this work was done by newer emerging companies that didn't really have to deal with all the sunk costs that they had to sort of decide, well, geez, do we completely, it's harder to reinvent something when you've invested so much in the status quo. I wanted to talk about the distinction between invention and implementation. And what you see on the left is the first really motor car, Benz, from 1886. And on the right, I've shown you Matthias's automobile. But it's, I think it's the Tesla Model S or something like that. And you say, well, geez, look at all the technology that's gone into the car. Wow, that's incredible. But it's critical to understand that to go from the picture on the left to the picture on the right, it isn't just the technology in the car, but it's the whole ecosystem around it that's required. When that first car started out, this is what the roads in Germany looked like at approximately that time. And if you contrast that to the, for example, the San Francisco, it's an example, highway system today, there's a lot of work that's gone into the infrastructure to support this technology to make it so you're really able to get some of the benefits of the automobile. And even, this is very dated, the diagram on the right has exploded since then. But that, one of the key aspects of even having electric cars is having an adequate number of charging stations so that you can fuel up basically. So critical point is that implementation is not instantaneous. And the distinction between invention and implementation often gets ignored. It's a great book, James Best and BU economist talked about this. And he highlights how almost all of the gains from new technologies were actually realized only after decades of actually figuring out how to use them. And there's a number of examples on the right, almost every category. And so implementation, it takes time, and it takes the people on the front lines who are actively working on this. And that's, I think, a lot of the people in this audience are these frontline users who are wrestling with these problems in our industries and our organizations, and are really trying to figure out how to apply technology. And the point is, it's not, despite what McKinsey or whoever might tell you, oh, you're way behind, someone else has figured it all out. For certainly in healthcare, no one's figured it out for the most part. And our challenge isn't to catch up, but to actually figure it out in the first place. And technologies go through these long periods of sequential innovation. Economist Gordon talked about in the area of transportation that most of the benefits to individuals didn't come with the initial innovation, but it required the decades of additional sub-inventions and incremental improvements so you could really utilize it. And the real champion of the lead user sort of theory is Eric von Hippel of MIT. I've really loved his writing on the topic, and really highlights how practitioners, the people who are actively in the trenches, up to their elbows in this stuff, the people who are on the front line are really responsible for driving so many of the most useful actual adaptations of technology to actually have them be useful. Now, one of the things I tell most of the companies I'm working with is what tech really requires is examples of palpable benefits. There's always all these theories, but so people don't sign up for Uber because they have some deep view of the gig economy. You press a button on your phone and a car shows. It's incredible. Google, you enter info in a box and an answer shows up. And so you don't have to do a lot of thinking about like you might need to do thinking about what are the consequences of this quote free technology in the case of Google, but in terms of the benefit, you immediately get it. And people say, well, medicine is different. You have to do all this education. And one example, like I've heard this forever in genetics. I spent several years as the chief medical officer of a DNA Nexus that actually has done some great work with Regeneron and the UK Biobank. Really terrific stuff. But there's always this debate. Well, if only people do more genetics, if only physicians, if only they were somehow better educated. Maybe, but it also turns out that actually people are pretty practical. So when non-invasive prenatal testing screening came along, to identify specific chromosomal abnormalities from a blood test instead of an amniocentesis, it was adopted almost overnight. Apparently, it was like the most rapidly adopted blood test in history. Point being that, like, when there's a real, when it has an obvious benefit, actually people figure out how to use it. And I think where we're at with a lot of the digital and data in healthcare is to go from what I call the dancing bear to palpable value. The whole thing, many versions of the quote, but about the dancing bear is the wonder is not how well the bear dances, but that he dances at all. So, you were able, you slap on a wearable, you're like, oh, we're able to measure someone's ambulating in a hospital and have something that's just as good as, oh, by the way, seeing if patient's walking around. And you're like, hey, we did digital health. And okay, well, that's maybe a first step, but what you really need are examples that really advance the field, that will really, in the case of pharma, will help organizations discover, develop, and deliver impactful new medicines to patients. So that part of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about where we are with AI. There's I'm going to talk about a number of books about it, but this is a nice quote from this book by Cade Metz of the Times, the book Genius Makers, where he describes it. He says, it was all mixed up into one enormous overflowing stew of very real technological advances, unfounded hype, wild predictions, and concern for the future. Artificial intelligence is the term that described it all. Probably pretty true. So for the journal, I reviewed a number of books about AI that I thought I would have the benefit of getting a one-slide summary of most of them and a few key points of these books. So starting off with this one called the wonderful book called The Alignment by Brian Christian. And the point he's obsessed with is the idea that as powerful as computers are, it's really hard to get them to do what we want them to do or what we think that they're doing. One example was, so there's, in health, was an algorithm that was, and this was never implemented, but it could have been, like it was on the verge of being implemented apparently. So it was an algorithm that was designed to triage, to route pneumonia patients in the ER. So patients come in with sort of potential pneumonia to the ER, to the emergency room, and you need to figure out, well, who gets admitted and who can be safely discharged without, killing them, which is an important thing to consider. And so the way when they did this initially, the data said, well, gosh, when we look at the what happens to was initially looking at the data was saying, oh, asthmatics can be rapidly discharged because they had an unusually in the data set, in the learning data set that the algorithm was based off of, the patients who had asthma actually had a lower risk of death from pneumonia than did a number of the other patients. So the algorithm was saying, okay, well, if you have asthma, I guess you're at lower risk. But someone looked at a human being, went back and said, that doesn't sound right. So they went back and looked at the data. And, by the way, what happened was the reason patients with asthma who came into the emergency room with rule out pneumonia suspicion did better was because as soon as they showed up, the emergency room doctors were like, holy camole, you go right to intensive care. So it was actually precisely because they were triaged to extra intense care, not because they were discharged, that they wound up having improved results, having having such a low mortality rate. And then, of course, we're all familiar with this example of Google Photos that they introduced this algorithm that was able to correctly identify, sort pictures and say, oh, this picture seems to be from graduation, but tragically or absurdly mischaracterized some people of color as identified on social media by a African American, I believe, engineer. It's like, hey, guys, you really screwed up here, which they acknowledged and they did, because of the inadequate training data. If like 90% of your training data is on one, one particular population, you're not going to you're going to mislearn. You're not going to get good data on different populations. And it's both a question of ethics and also, and this is the point in my department, Zach Kohaney makes brilliantly, that it's really about both the ethics, but also the science. It's not, you don't make good predictions if you don't have really a global representation of people. And then as challenging as all this is, it's even harder to get computers to understand you and value. So his bottom line is that computers aren't going to provide some magic tech fix for our most vexing ethical problem. Like they hold up a mirror to the issues, but they're not going to solve it. Like there's a famous railway problem where a train is heading for 5 people and you're at a switch. Would you switch it so that you go instead of the 5 people, it just kills 1, but then you did it as an active act instead of passively letting it happen? Like you can't say, oh, Siri, what should I do? Siri will report back whatever you kind of taught it to do, maybe. But it's not going to somehow have some magic tech answer for these complex ethical dilemmas. And there was actually a really positive bottom line to this as well, which was that the AI field, as Kristen described, was, while late to the party maybe, although earlier than many other fields, they kind of got it, it seems, and really became incredibly responsive and even leaders in being responsive to these limitations. All right, so quickly to zip through some of these other books, really probably the best overview of all, and kind of highly recommended, is this book, Genius Makers by Metz. It's a really engaging historical account of how deep learning developed. Told your stories are protagonists. So when I was growing up, I'm not a kid, I remember many of you, I'm sure Matthias read this, a book called Microbe Hunters, right? De Kruif, about these, the early days of these hero microbiologists, essentially. And then when I was I really was a nerdy kid. When I was in high school, I was incredibly attracted to this book, Eighth Day of Creation, about the history of molecular biology by Horace Freeland Judson. And this is kind of a version of that for deep learning, where you get to know the people, the science, and it's really compelling. And how these people kind of, despite all the skepticism, kind of, particularly Jeff Hinton, drove this idea forward. And what emerged was this global arms race. Peter Lee at Microsoft said that the cost of acquiring an AI researcher is akin to the cost of acquiring an NFL quarterback. One interesting take from the book was, some researchers or researchers at Facebook who offered a very measured perspective, but others were more grandiose and lived as if the future was already here. Since, as the author said, ideas might fail, predictions might not be met, but the next idea wouldn't succeed unless they and everybody around them believed that it could. So this is sort of explaining for the hype that if you want to live in a future where, let's say, there's AI, you have to talk like it's, sort of like fake it till you make it, essentially. And that was that perspective. This is a history of AI by Woolridge, who quickly dismisses the grand dream of AI doing the full range of things that a person can do. He is impressed by the promise of AI, but worries about overestimating it, like calling Tesla autopilot, where it's not technically an autopilot and actually may encourage risky behavior with that name. He too worries about deep learning. He worries that it's, and this is, and I've written about this extensively in healthcare and medicine, that the intelligence is opaque. You don't know how answers are being arrived at. Now, you don't always know that for humans, of course, by the way. Someone says, oh, I think this is disease 1 or disease 2. You don't necessarily know the reasoning process either. But also, the networks are not robust. There's these adversarial attacks where you change a pixel in the sign, and all of a sudden, for example, in a road sign, all of a sudden it can think it's a completely different sign, even though a human can't even tell the difference. So because you don't know what's going on, a slight tweak that a person might not even notice could have a tragic result. And he highlights the importance of accountability, responsibility, and transparency. The next book is The Myth of AI, which really, again, highlights that human and computer intelligence are very different, and that in our minds aren't just reductive algorithms, but a much broader context. And he also highlights that we're doing two things. We're both defining intelligence down, human intelligence down, and overestimating AI. He's appreciative of Watson's Jeopardy success, but then kind of goes backstage and talks about all the clever shortcuts that they kind of developed to help the program succeed, that humans figured out, including the fact that 95% of Jeopardy answers are, at least at the time, were Wikipedia titles, which kind of reduces your search space. In my review of it, I kind of thought this was important. By reinterpreting human intelligence to fit a computational definition, he says, we risk abandoning a rich understanding of the human mind, Mr. Larson says. He invokes tech writer Jaron Lanier's lament that a new generation has come of age with a reduced expectation of what a person can be and who each person might become. He also says another concern is that this learned passivity, our view that AI will figure it out, essentially, and that we need to cultivate human ingenuity. And he reminds us that computers don't have insights, people do. All right, next book is Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI. And this is easily the most quotable book. Very much, I would say, in line politically with that Techlash book. And she focuses on AI as the latest expression of entrenched power dynamics. And argues that while AI is presented as disembodied, objective, and inevitable, it's kind of the opposite. And as well as, for good measure, extractive and exploitative. She's concerned with the flawed databases that are used to train AI. She talks about a criminal database, a gang database that actually includes the name of infants, including 28 who admitted to being gang members. So you kind of wonder about the quality of data there. And then I think this is probably the most important point, maybe in any book, that a lot of times we measure what we can, not what we should. She says measurements like skin color detection or cranial measurements, that's talk about a reminder of like that the bad old days, are made because phrenology, literally phrenology in some of these cases, are made, quote, because it is a method that can be done with ML. This is my favorite line. The affordances of the tools become the horizon of truth. Like you do what you can, not what you necessarily should. The affordances of the tools become the horizon of truth. It's brilliant. And then finally, there's another last book with Future Proof by Kevin Roos of the Times again, which is sort of like, okay, how can you help get yourself ready for the future of AI and with AI and automation? And first of all, he says, what we should worry about isn't that, again, people are going to be substituted, like Jetson style by robots, but rather that with AI efficiencies, there'll be a reduction in staffing needs. But unlike saying that, oh, you need to lean into STEM, you need to learn how to code, he suggests instead we lean into our humanity, because that's what computers will never be able to do. One encouraging example was Best Buy. They figured out they couldn't compete with Amazon. Best Buy, sort of this big box store that sells electronics. They were getting crushed by Amazon. So the CEO refocused the company on customer service, providing, quote, deeply human experiences that e-commerce retailers couldn't match. A home advisor program was a hit, and the company did really well with that insight. And so he realized that the business is not simply selling products, it's connecting human needs with technology solutions. And I thought that was a real significant insight. I wanted to highlight these 4 choice phrases from these books that really kind of highlight a key theme. One is the phrase post-work. And that's human-fueled automation. It's essentially all of the very human effort that backstops the AI, that sort of annotates pictures and does feature identification, does all this stuff that ultimately may enable AI to do things. And so the point is, at that level, that, sort of like the feature identification and deciding about that is in many ways a very human endeavor. Next phrase, again, it's so good, is enchanted determinism. The idea is that AI approaches, precisely because they are uninterpretable, they acquire a mystical, almost theological quality. It's too complex for mere humans to understand or regulate. It's mythology. And it's critical to realize that AI is not magical or mythical or divine. And you sort of can't approach it, oh, that's what the AI said, and then just sort of, submissively go on with your life. And that's not the right attitude. The third, we talked about this already, the affordances of the tools, not the horizons of truth. We need to step up and figure out what are the right questions to ask, rather than simply, and this is a huge issue in biotech, ask simply what's easiest to frame computationally. And then finally, there's this dogma of inevitability, the view that if it can be done, it will be done. So no point in trying to stop or modulate it. And as I think it was Kevin Roos said, the future is not a spectator sport. We should engage with it, not just say, well, it's going to happen anyway, so what can we do? This learned helplessness is not the way to go. In case this view seems unduly negative or non-representative, this is a feature from the Wall Street Journal's tech reporter, commentator Chris Mims in July, going over some of the same stuff, why artificial intelligence isn't intelligent. And then another article from late July from Technology Review about basically how tools, all these AI tools really didn't do much for COVID. Now, that is something I saw firsthand. I had a privilege to work with several colleagues, including specifically Amy Abernethy, formerly of the FDA, now at Verily, and Peter Lee, we talked about earlier, the EVP of Microsoft, on National Academy of Medicine Commission sort of review on how did the country do in response to COVID in many categories. We were looking at the digital and data, and it was pretty suboptimal. And a lot of the issue is you can't do AI when you don't have like good quality underlying data. And so you look at where AI has been really helpful in things like chat. We have unbelievable amounts of data, or figure out if a valve is going to break by having tons of data on a valve. But it was you just don't like. It's not this magic answer that comes in from the sky, AI ex machina or whatever, and this solves your problems. It's basically a specific set of approaches that require underlying data to be able to be effective. I'm not going to go into a lot of this, but this is exactly an issue in drug discovery as well. This is two folks, one from the UK, I guess both from the UK. I thought one was from the continent. Wrote a great two-part review going over like chapter and verse of all the ways that actually AI is really has not just solved the key issue of drug discovery, which is making better decisions. And the wonderful Derek Lowe, who's really done a lot of great job in his science blog, translating a lot of the issues. Basically says we're solving models, and then we're sort of getting these Pyrrhic victories. Oh, we've done, AI can help us with these. Essentially, it's almost like the Luddic fallacy in a way that Taleb talks about. You're solving these essentially artificial problems in some cases, but that's not really what the most problem is. The biggest problem is in a lot of drug development. And so it's you may be able to use AI, but it's not really moving the ball downfield very far. They talk about some of the reasons. So with that, at 2:15, or my time anyway, I'm going to stop and thank you all for listening, and hoping not really that I can answer questions, but that maybe we can have, and I hope Matthias participates as well, because he's actually done some real work in this, very thoughtful work in this area, and as have others who I know are on the line. So maybe we can go into a discussion at this point.
Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. Thanks for this overview, for all the book recommendations. I didn't promise too much about that one. Yeah, everyone, please ask your short questions. There's so much to talk about, so many interesting aspects of what's going on with AI and health. And I'd like to kick off.
Matthias, maybe one area that we could throw it open for perspective on. And again, I welcome both questions, but also people sharing their experience. Is one of the big themes of a lot of these is that there's a real challenge of trying to imagine there's going to be a tech solution for what is almost invariably a human problem. It's a personal problem. You know, like getting someone to enter data or getting the data to be available or getting people to share data. And it's not that we don't have, I mean, this is, I can't do Peter Lee justice, but I think it gets to be maddening where, you know, people can imagine, you know, the technology solutions in many cases are border on trivial. It's the actual getting the right data, getting people to enter it, getting people to collect it. There was shared data, for example, in health, that's far more you know, challenging and nuanced than, oh, we need some magic technology that's going to solve it. The technology, again, like we saw for telehealth, like when telehealth took over or gained prominence during COVID, it wasn't that brilliant technologists had just figured out how to use video phone calls, basically. That's been around forever. It was just, what actually made the difference there was people saying, oh, okay, we're going to clear the regulatory and the reimbursement hurdles in the US so that that can be enabled. That was the key factor, not technology, but essentially creating the environment where the technology can be unleashed and appropriately incentivized.
Yeah, David, one aspect that that came to my mind as I listened to your talk, and it was one of the quotes of the books you presented, is that essentially whatever simple or complex model we train, it's sort of on data that we have at hand, is sort of a mirror of the historical, you know, social and so forth contexts of this world, right, of the world as we see it. And how do you think we can get past that? How do we come to a point where our healthcare infrastructure works to produce that kind of unbiased data? I mean, data is mostly generated in a tidy fashion for insurance claim purposes. That works really well, right? But how do we get to a point that it's also working for innovation research?
I think it's really, really complicated. And again, as our mutual colleague Zach and folks at the DBMI have described, what EMRs really capture isn't so much a record of the patient's biology, but rather of a physician's interaction with the healthcare system. One of the best examples I know, like I'm sure you've heard Zach talk about this once or twice, is it turns out that, like, I'm sure I'm butchering it, but essentially a normal potassium collected at 3 in the morning has a way worse prognostic sign than a abnormal potassium collected at 3 in the afternoon. And when you ask these tech folks, some number of tech folks about, it's like, oh, well, it's certain rhythm or whatever, none of that at all. What happens is there's no reason on God's green earth why you should have a potassium checked at 3 in the morning unless you get a blood gas because, like, you're crashing and someone's trying to figure out why. So maybe it's not the potassium, maybe it's something else. But and that's the process of care, nothing to do with the biology. And not that everything's like that, but even a lot of the learning that people are getting, it actually is kind of from mirroring the physician's progressive learning and the tests they order or don't order. There's remarkable work, again, from Zach's group, right? That by just seeing what tests are done, even if you don't know the results of the test, that's really predictive. So it's kind of important to understand what data you're getting on what data you're not. Now, the tech answer for a lot of this stuff is we need to collect more and more data. We need to essentially, they want to sort of have everybody, they imagine this, sort of maybe the tech wet dream here seems to be, apologies for generalizing, to sort of have everybody wired up, completely wired and reporting out tons and tons of robustly collected data and all these data points and everyone entering it. and some really smart, I imagine, engineers in some central place with their computers analyzing it and finally making the decisions that we sort of need. I don't see that happening. I think that no one, I mean, that's the issue. Like from the engineer perspective, maybe that would be the best way to collect robust data and to sort of assess outcomes. And I just don't know how you get there. I don't think that's what anybody else wants. I don't think people want to be monitored like that. I don't think physicians want to work like that. And a lot of the value of physician-patient interaction isn't, it's not like going to Pep Boys or, these sort of, shoots, car places, transmission places where you stick the wire in, they sort of give you a diagnostic code and you treat it. It's a lot of times it's these complex human relationships and you understand the patient. Now, you get further with a curative drug and a good therapeutic relationship probably than just a good therapeutic relationship alone. I appreciate that. But I think that the idea of just kind of having this, the same way this ultra reductive view didn't really work, that was not the right approach for medicine. For molecular biology, let's reduce everyone to their genes. We're going to, and actually, I didn't include any of those slides, but there's an absolutely parallel story in the history of molecular biology. And Richard Lewontin wrote wonderfully about this. He's the Harvard geneticist who recently just passed away. He wrote this famous New York Review of Books piece called I Dream of Genome, something like that, where basically he described how people fetishize genetic information, essentially overvalue it and undervalue the context in which people live. And he was really prescient about aspects of that. Now, for people who have some diseases, for cystic fibrosis, people who have Tay-Sachs, actually, you know what? You can fix the gene for cystic fibrosis. If you can fix the gene for sickle cell, there, finally, there's some hope on the horizon. But if you look at that, Linus Pauling identified that, over 5 decades ago, first molecular disease identified. And it's taken forever to actually have a molecularly based cure. So in some cases, for some of these like monogenic conditions, you can envision these simplistic solutions. You would like to be able to, it would be incredible. But mostly it's more complicated. And I think we're going to see exactly the same thing for a lot of this digital data, where it's not going to be as reductive as some might initially manage. But I think that's how ideas evolve.
Yeah, thank you. So in the beginning of your answer, you started off by saying that medical data is usually the result of the interaction between the physician and the patient with respect to what can be built. And we have one question of a webinar attendee who's thinking about how can this dilemma be resolved, that the reason why data is collated is because of insurance claims, but how do we get a more meaningful account of the data that are meaningful in terms of the biology and health and disease state? Right,
and it's a real dilemma, and it's a dilemma. I mean, and an explicit manifestation of this dilemma, and this is something that Amy Abernethy has talked about beautifully, where she was saying, okay, so she's at Duke, she's doing oncology at Duke, right? So she said her patients would come in Monday. Her oncology patients would come in. She'd evaluate them, treat them, have a regular session on Monday. And then guess what? They'd come back on Tuesday to enroll for a clinical study. And kind of go, and she said, well, that seemed incredibly redundant. And so there's this idea, well, couldn't you combine aspect, there are different versions of it, but one is from the research perspective is, can you use real world data? Can you use some of the data that you can collect in the context of patients? Maybe with some adjustments, some more, I actually used to be, I think, more optimistic about it than I am now, only because the rigor of sort of studies, what you collect for studies is so much more standard, not just standardized, but comprehensive. And it's done in a particular way. I love what I think is critically important about real world evidence is what actually matters are real world outcomes. I think there are incredible opportunities to see how medicines are working in the real world, to see which treatment approaches may in practice not be working, which may be working better. And if you actually had an opportunity to in some way keep track of this better, it would seem there should be opportunities to say, the patients who have this collection of this diagnostic code or this condition seems to be living a little bit longer. To the extent you can even calculate that from the data, it's actually pretty hard. You don't necessarily, you have to work hard to actually get a patient trajectory. You can't really pull a patient trajectory out of the EHR very easily. And that was one of the things with Flatiron, I had to really figure out how to do. To figure out how is the patient doing. But to the extent you're able to do that, that's really important. I think of an example that Atul Gawande wrote about in the care of CF, where he describes one doctor who just had a much better approach for treating patients, and their outcomes were differentially better. And so by seeing that result, they were able to then go back to the physician and say, what are you doing that's different? I can imagine for so many, like there might be some medicine that most people aren't, that some physician, through being a frontline user, is able to kind of make some adjustments or split the dose or offer medicine plus something else. And if you actually were able to kind of robustly keep track of that, I would think there would be real opportunities, because what really matters, isn't just your phase 3 study for FDA approval, but how a medicine is doing in the real world. And often this is seen as a potential risk for drug manufacturers, because, oh, what if a drug in reality doesn't do as well, which it won't, because in clinical trials, you kind of pick people who are kind of healthier typically, or don't have as many comorbidities to simplify the interpretation. But I also can imagine a real upside whereby keeping, by having more robust data sets, you're able to see, well, geez, these patients did unexpectedly well, the same way that Zach has this study, these sort of rare survivors, people who did unexpected, the examples of the unexpected survivor is always such a great source of knowledge in medicine. What made this person different? Why did this person survive when other people did? And I think that if there's a way to combine it with EHR, so you're able to say, oh, to at least make you go back and look and say, oh, this physician, these patients in this setting. Now, 90% of the time, it's just going to be they were coded differently, or they were up-coded so they seemed sicker, but they weren't, or there's going to be some, basically economic-related reason, I would guess, cynically. But occasionally you might find, okay, these people really look similar, but this person in this care of this person does better, or in care of this team more likely, again, to go on these points. So I think there's some real opportunities there.
Yeah, David, so you talked about in the beginning that the field is now under pressure to show real world and clinical utility. And this also leads to goes well with a question from Marjorie Rotenberg, who's interested in knowing, first of all, what's your favorite AI in health application? And if you have an example of a successful and maybe of unsuccessful AI applications.
Right. I think it's a process. So I kind of feel like versus like wins versus losses. I think maybe I'll politically do one of these clever things and say, well, my favorite story is the AI retinopathy story with Google, right? Where they are able to, imaging really is an area where you have AI that's very good. And they were able to, I think it's instructive because they were able to, kind of for reasonable reasons, able to kind of use AI to kind of identify a researcher at Google who actually apparently had other issues in terms of how we would treat people. And it comes up in one of these Genius Makers books. But people are complicated. But the idea he wanted to do good for people in India is my understanding, and use AI. And the idea is a lot of these people don't have any access. Who have diabetes don't have access to eye care. You can maybe these remote clinics get some evaluation. And I guess the technology in the theoretical setting works great. In the real world setting, it's a lot dicier for a lot of real world reasons. And so I think understanding the disconnect, the kind of the last mile issues are going to be really important, because academics typically are like, oh, here's our paper showing this great ROC and blah blah blah, it looks terrific. But ultimately, what really matters is being able to make a real world difference in the treatment and care of people. And so finding areas where technology can do that, and it doesn't have to be diagnosing, it can be supporting, it can be helping physicians who are able to, by saying, hey, it's a dilemma, by the way. It's just an example. You say, okay, well, AI is always presented, well, look at radiology reads and kind of be able to, double check, let's say the reader and say, oh, you missed this, what about this? And this is just like an ongoing tension, is as the more technologies you have as fallback, the more kind of careless people tend to become. It's like a law for this, actually. The example with seatbelts, where people, seatbelts are good. They save lives, by the way, buckle up. But when people use seatbelts, they drive quicker and more recklessly because they feel more secure because they have it. So working on that balance and finding ways for technology to be as maximally helpful without generating new areas of risk is going to be critical as well.
Yeah, yeah. So David, we're at the hour. I'd like to close with a question, again, taking a quote from one of your slides. So the community is now, or, the sort of the shortcomings of current AI approaches, and mostly based on the way and the data we have at hand to train models. Now the community realizes that AI is not magical. It's not any divine intelligence. And I wonder, what do you think about the responsibility we have, as the research community has? Because I think everybody has jumped on the train of writing in grants that AI is the solution to many problems, to get more grants, to get attention, to compete for taxpayers' research money.
Right.
Are we running into another AI winter of disappointment, or what's our responsibility in that respect?
Well, it's a great question. Characteristically, great question, Matthias. So this is the number one issue that I think a lot of people worry about in the background. And how do you walk that line where you want to kind of maintain the excitement about it? On the other hand, because by the way, that's how people apply for grants. That's what in industry, that's what people do. Like the seek function on Excel. It's just a matter of weeks, I'm sure, before that becomes, Excel, now with AI or whatever. Like every progression has now become AI. So I think that you're right. There is a little bit of this bogus rebranding, but there's a real concern that if there's overhype, there's going to be a winter. I'm not sure. I think it's going to happen because of the bias issue, only because I feel like the field has been, it seems to me, very responsive, really proactive compared to a lot of other disciplines on really dealing with it. I think, it seems to me, and again, like maybe there are other perspectives, someone should let me know. I think that if you don't have an appropriate, like the idea that if you need a really diverse, like authentically diverse, really global sample, or your results are going to be biased, it's top of everybody's mind now, it seems like to me. And I don't know how you're going to get anything published if you don't really deeply work in those, consider that and respond to it. And hopefully, I think that is going to result in better and more predictive and, in a sense, more cautious interpretations of the science. Yeah. I actually feel optimistic about that. I think, it's really an interesting question of the gap between what the technology is saying it's going to do. And I guess as long as there's so much free money, with the rates where they are at so many companies, and everyone's saying they're doing it, like you won't even get attention if you're not saying you're doing AI. So I think that is a real concern about hype and that people will just get concerned that it was over. What I'm hoping, I guess I tend to be an optimist by nature, is that there will start to be some clear applications where it really does make a discrete difference. The complex part of it is it may not be, and here's a cure for cancer in an obvious way. It may be, well, we can make aspects of the process more operationally more efficient, which is totally unsexy, but actually really helpful.
Yeah. Great. David, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
It's always, I love seeing how you connect all these fascinating books with your own experience through clinics, research, and the corporate world. That's really illuminating. Even though so many issues around AI and health are there and remain, of course. In some of our next sessions in October, we'll have Siad Obermeyer, also from the Bay Area, talk about biases in algorithms. So that's one of the shortcomings that we've talked about today as well. And so we're curious to see if you, our participants, would be interested in recommending these webinars to your colleagues. So we're going to launch a quick poll And I'd also like to mention that the focus group on AI and health is going to meet next week, and it's open to anyone interested. So you can just go on the link in the chat or Google your way to the website and register for the meeting, where many of the issues that came up today with David will be discussed. And with that, we've reached the end of the meeting today, of the discussion. Thank you again, David. Thanks to Bastian, Ida, Reinhard, and the ITU team making all this possible. And hope to see you next time. Have a good night. Bye.
Take care.